Sometimes the things we've lost find a way back to us. Sometimes it takes getting lost in the wilderness to finally discover what we've been searching for. After a storm leaves widower Silas Rourke stranded with a lame horse, he follows his injured mare down a forgotten arroyo into a hidden canyon, lush green, untouched by time. An abandoned homestead holds letters and journals from a family who vanished 50 years ago. As Silas pieces together their story, he finds echoes of his own losses. Could this sacred place offer the healing he never thought he'd earn? Before we jump back in, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and tell us your story. And if this tale touches something in your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special waiting for you. The high desert had a way of stripping a man down to what he truly was. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest paved road, the land didn't care about your past or your pain. It simply asked if you were strong enough to meet it on its own terms. Silas Rourke had been asking himself that same question for 3 years now, ever since Clara passed. He stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house that Thursday morning, coffee mug warming his calloused hands, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridgeline. 58 years old, and he could feel every one of them in his knees, his lower back, the stiffness in his shoulders that took longer to work out each morning. His face had been carved by wind and sun into deep lines that bracketed his mouth and fanned out from his grey eyes. He'd stopped shaving regularly after Clara died. The silver beard suited him, she would have said, made him look distinguished instead of just old. The ranch house sat in a shallow valley, sheltered on 3 sides by rust-colored hills dotted with juniper and sage. 200 acres of hard country that had been in his family since his grandfather's time. The barn needed fresh paint, the corral fence had posts that wanted replacing, and the old windmill squeaked something terrible when the wind picked up. Silas kept a mental list of these things, but the list never seemed to get shorter. When Clara was alive, she'd gently nag him about the repairs, and somehow that made them easier to tackle. Now, the projects just felt like echoes of conversations he'd never have again. He drained the last of his coffee and set the mug on the porch rail. The worn leather saddlebag sat beside the front door where he'd left it last night, packed and ready. That bag had been with him for 30 years, a gift from Clara on their 10th anniversary. The leather was scarred and faded now, the stitching repaired in half a dozen places. It held everything he needed for a day's ride: water, jerky, basic first aid, rope, matches, and the brass compass Clara had given him on their wedding day. He never rode out without that compass, even though he knew these hills like the lines on his own palms. The compass had become something more than a navigational tool. It was a talisman, a connection to her. Some mornings he'd take it out and hold it, remembering how she'd pressed it into his hand at the altar 28 years ago with tears in her eyes. "So you'll always find your way back to me," she'd whispered. He had every single time, until cancer took her and left him with no direction that felt right anymore. Silas walked down the porch steps, his boots crunching on the gravel. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and dust. By afternoon it would be hot enough to shimmer the horizon, but dawn was still gentle. He could hear Duchess before he saw her, that low, nickering sound she made when she knew he was coming. His mare, a 12-year-old chestnut with a white blaze, and 3 white socks, stood at the corral fence with her ears forward, watching his approach. "Morning, girl," he said softly, running his hand down her neck. Her coat was warm and smooth under his palm. Duchess leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. She was all he had for company these days, and sometimes he talked to her more than he'd ever talked to another human being. She didn't judge, didn't offer advice, didn't look at him with that mixture of pity and concern he saw in other people's faces when they asked how he was doing. He'd bought Duchess as a 3-year-old, trained her himself, and she'd been Clara's favorite. His wife used to bring carrots out to the corral every evening, would brush Duchess until her coat gleamed. After Clara died, Silas couldn't bring himself to sell the horse, even though 1 mount was more than enough for his needs. Duchess was a living connection to those better days. Silas saddled her with practiced efficiency, checking the cinch twice, making sure the bit sat comfortable in her mouth. He tied the saddlebag behind the cantle and swung himself up, feeling the familiar protest from his right knee. Getting old wasn't for the faint of heart. But once he was settled in the saddle, some of that stiffness faded. This was where he belonged. This was the one place where he still felt like himself. He pointed Duchess toward the northern trail, intending to check the fence line along the property's far boundary. He hadn't been out that way in months, maybe longer. The remote sections of the ranch had a way of slipping from his attention. When Clara was alive, they'd ride out together, make a day of it, pack a lunch, and eat it on some high ridge while watching hawks circle overhead. Now he only went when necessity demanded it. The trail climbed gradually through scattered juniper, following the contours of the land. Silas rode with the easy posture of a man who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle, his body moving with Duchess's rhythm without conscious thought. The sun warmed his back. A lizard skittered across a rock. In the distance, a raven called out, its voice harsh and lonely. He tried not to think about the fact that it had been 2 weeks since he'd spoken to another person. Old Jim Henderson from the neighboring ranch had stopped by, worried because he hadn't seen smoke from Silas's chimney. Silas had assured him everything was fine, had even accepted a casserole Jim's wife had sent over, though it had sat in his refrigerator for 3 days before he threw it out, untouched. He knew they meant well. Everyone meant well. But their concern felt like pressure, like an obligation to be something he wasn't ready to be yet. 3 days ago, he'd driven into Cottonwood Springs for supplies. The town sat 40 miles south, population 800 and shrinking. The feed store, the diner, the gas station, the post office that doubled as a general store. That was about it. Silas had loaded his truck with 50-pound bags of feed, filled his prescriptions at the pharmacy, and stopped at the diner for breakfast because he'd run out of eggs. Martha Connolly, who'd been running the diner since before Silas was born, had poured his coffee without asking, and set a plate of biscuits and gravy in front of him that could have fed 3 men. "You're looking thin, Silas," she'd said, not unkindly. "Clara wouldn't want you wasting away." He'd managed a smile, thanked her, and ate what he could. But her words had sat heavy in his chest. Everyone invoked Clara's name like it was a magic spell that could pull him back to the living. The truth was, he didn't know what Clara would want. She'd made him promise not to shut down after she was gone, had made him swear he'd stay connected to their friends, to the community. He'd promised, his hand holding hers in that hospital bed, her skin papery and thin, her breathing labored. He'd promised, and then she'd died, and he'd broken that promise almost immediately. At the general store, Tom Begay had asked him to join the volunteer fire department's poker game next Friday. Silas had nodded, said maybe, knowing he wouldn't go. Sarah Chen had invited him to her daughter's wedding in June. Again, he'd been non-committal. These were good people, people who'd known him and Clara for decades, but being around them hurt. They reminded him of everything he'd lost, of the man he used to be when Clara was beside him. The ride back to the ranch had been quiet, just him and the truck's engine, and the endless stretch of 2-lane highway cutting through empty country. He'd felt relief when he pulled into his driveway, when he could shut the door and be alone again with his grief. Now, 3 days later, he was back in the saddle, back in the place where his thoughts could wander without the pressure of other people's expectations. Duchess's hooves struck a steady rhythm on the packed earth. The trail narrowed as it followed a dry wash, the banks rising on either side. Silas noticed the clouds building to the west, dark and heavy. Weather in the high desert could turn on a dime. He should have checked the forecast, but he'd grown careless about such things. The fence line, when he reached it, was in worse shape than he'd expected. 2 posts had rotted through at the base and leaned at crazy angles. The wire sagged between them, practically touching the ground. Cattle could walk right through. Not that he had many cattle anymore. He'd sold off most of the herd after Clara died, keeping just enough to justify calling it a ranch. But still, a fence was a fence. It needed fixing. He dismounted, tied Duchess to a sturdy juniper and walked the fence line, assessing the damage. He'd need to come back with tools, new posts, fresh wire. Add it to the list. The thought made him tired. Everything made him tired these days. A gust of wind kicked up dust and rattled the dry brush. Silas looked west again and saw the clouds had grown darker, closer. The air had that electric quality that comes before a storm. He should head back. The smart thing would be to turn around right now and make for home before the weather hit. But something in him resisted. Out here, with the wind picking up and the first distant rumble of thunder rolling across the hills, he felt more alive than he had in months. The storm didn't care about his grief. It didn't offer sympathy or advice. It simply was, and there was something clean about that, something honest. He untied Duchess and swung back into the saddle. Instead of turning toward home, he pointed her north, following the fence line deeper into the remote country. Just a little farther, he told himself, just to see what else needed attention. But really, he was running from something he couldn't name, pushing into the emptiness, because it was easier than sitting still with his thoughts. The wind grew stronger. The sky darkened. Silas rode on, and Duchess followed, trusting his judgment the way she always had. Neither of them knew that this ride would change everything, that the storm bearing down on them was about to strip away the careful isolation Silas had built around himself and lead them both to a place that shouldn't exist, a hidden canyon where secrets waited in the silence, and where a lonely man might finally find a path back to himself. The storm caught them 5 miles past the broken fence line, in a stretch of country Silas hadn't visited in years. One moment the clouds were building on the horizon. The next, the sky opened up with a violence that took his breath away. Rain came down in sheets driven sideways by wind that bent the juniper trees nearly horizontal. Thunder cracked so close overhead that Silas felt it in his chest, and lightning forked across the sky in brilliant white branches. Duchess danced nervously beneath him, her ears pinned back, her muscles tense and trembling. "Easy, girl," Silas said, keeping his voice calm, even as water poured down his face and soaked through his shirt. "We'll find shelter. Easy now." He looked around for options. They'd been following a ridgeline, exposed on all sides, which was about the worst place to be in a lightning storm. Below, and to the east, he could make out a cluster of larger rocks that might offer some protection. He turned Duchess that direction, urging her down the slope, but she resisted, pulling against the reins, her head tossing. Another crack of lightning, this one so close the air smelled of ozone. The bolt struck a dead juniper not 30 yards away, splitting it down the middle with a sound like a rifle shot. That was all it took. Duchess panicked. She reared, and Silas, caught off guard, nearly lost his seat. He grabbed for the saddle horn, his hat flying off into the wind. Duchess came down hard, her front hooves striking the rocky slope at an angle, and immediately Silas felt something go wrong. The mare stumbled, her right foreleg buckling beneath her, and they both went down. Silas kicked free of the stirrups just in time, hitting the ground hard on his left shoulder. Pain shot through his arm and back, but he rolled clear as Duchess scrambled to regain her footing. The mare made it up on 3 legs, but her right front hoof barely touched the ground. She held it at an awkward angle, her weight shifted back, and when she tried to take a step, she nearly went down again. "No," Silas breathed, pushing himself to his feet despite the pain in his shoulder. "No, no, no." He approached her slowly, hands out, speaking in low tones. Duchess's eyes were wide with fear and pain, rain streaming down her face. She let him take her reins, let him run his hands down her injured leg. Even through the rain, he could feel the heat and swelling above her knee. Not broken, he didn't think. His fingers found no grinding or unnatural angles, but badly strained or torn. Either way, she couldn't carry his weight. Maybe couldn't walk at all. The reality of their situation settled over him like a weight. They were miles from the ranch, miles from anywhere, with no shelter in sight, and a storm that showed no signs of letting up. His shoulder throbbed where he'd hit the ground. Water ran in rivulets down his back, and his horse, his only companion and his only way home, stood shivering and 3-legged beside him. Silas looked around, squinting through the rain. The broken country stretched in all directions, hills and washes and endless sage. Even if he left Duchess here and walked, he'd never make it back before dark, not in these conditions. And leaving her was unthinkable. She was all he had left of his old life, of Clara. He'd die out here before he'd abandon her. He reached into his saddlebag, his hands clumsy with cold and stress, and pulled out Clara's brass compass. Water beaded on its surface as he flipped it open. The needle swung and settled, pointing north. For what it's worth, he thought. But then, looking at it, he remembered Clara's words. So you'll always find your way back to me. All right, he said aloud, though whether to Clara's memory or to himself or to Duchess, he couldn't say. All right. We figure this out. He couldn't ride, and Duchess could barely walk, but they had to move. Staying exposed on this ridge would get them both killed. He took her reins gently and started leading her downslope, away from the lightning, toward lower ground where they might find some protection. Every step made her limp worse, and guilt tore at him. This was his fault. He'd ridden out into a storm like a fool, too caught up in his own misery to pay attention to the weather, and now Duchess was paying the price. But something strange happened as they moved. Duchess, despite her injury, despite her obvious pain, began pulling at the reins. Not resisting exactly, but leading. She wanted to go in a specific direction, down into a narrow wash that cut between two hills. Silas had never been in this particular drainage before. At least, he didn't think he had. Everything looked different in the storm. You know something I don't, girl? He asked, giving her head. All right. You've got better instincts than I do. They descended into the wash, Duchess moving with determination despite her limp, three-legged but purposeful. The wash walls rose on either side, cutting the wind slightly, offering marginal protection from the rain. Silas wiped water from his eyes and followed, one hand on Duchess's neck, feeling her warmth even through the cold rain. The wash narrowed, became a proper arroyo, with vertical walls of red stone. Still, Duchess led him forward, deeper into country that felt increasingly unfamiliar. Silas pulled out the compass again, checking their direction. They were heading northeast now, into a section of his property he'd rarely visited. Or was it still his property? He couldn't be certain. The boundary lines in this remote territory were old and poorly marked. His shoulder ached. His boots were full of water. The cold was starting to work its way into his bones, and he knew hypothermia was a real danger. They needed shelter soon, needed to get out of this storm and get dry. He was about to suggest to Duchess that they find an overhang, any kind of protection, when the arroyo took a sharp turn to the left, and there, through the curtain of rain, Silas saw something impossible. Green, not the grey-green of sage or the darker green of juniper, but vivid, lush green, grass, trees. He blinked, certain he was seeing things, that the cold and exhaustion were playing tricks on him. But no, it was real. The arroyo opened ahead into what looked like a canyon, and inside that canyon, sheltered and hidden, vegetation grew in thick profusion. Duchess quickened her pace, pulling him forward despite her injury. She could smell water, he realized. Fresh water, not just rainwater, but a real source. His heart beat faster. What was this place? How had he never known it was here? They rounded the final bend, and the arroyo walls fell away. The canyon opened before them like a secret the desert had kept for 1,000 years. Waterfalls cascaded down the far wall, feeding a clear pool at the canyon's heart. Cottonwood trees grew tall and thick, their leaves turning silver in the rain. Grass, actual grass, covered the canyon floor in patches of brilliant green. And in the center of it all, almost hidden by vegetation, stood the unmistakable shape of a structure. A building, a homestead. Silas stopped walking and just stared. Duchess pulled at the reins, wanting to get to that water, but he couldn't move. This couldn't be real, couldn't exist. He'd ridden this property his whole life, had studied maps and surveys, had walked these hills as a boy with his father. There was no hidden canyon, no lush oasis in the middle of the high desert. It was impossible, but Duchess didn't care about impossible. She limped forward, and Silas, almost in a daze, followed. The rain continued to pour down, but here in the canyon it felt different, less violent, as if the walls themselves offered protection. They passed through what looked like an old wooden gate, weathered but still standing, carved with initials, and a date he couldn't quite make out through the water streaming down his face. Thunder rolled overhead, but it sounded distant now, fading. The storm was moving on, having delivered them to this impossible place. Silas led Duchess toward the pool, and she drank deeply, her sides heaving, her injured leg still held off the ground. He knelt beside her and cupped his hands, bringing water to his own mouth. It tasted cold and clean and pure, better than anything he'd ever drunk. And as the rain began to ease, as the clouds started to break apart overhead, Silas looked around at this hidden sanctuary and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not quite hope, that would be too strong a word, but possibility. The possibility that the world still held mysteries, that there were still places he hadn't been, stories he didn't know, discoveries to be made. He didn't understand how or why, but Duchess had led him here. His injured horse, moving on faith and instinct, had brought them both to shelter when he'd been ready to give up. And now, standing in this impossible canyon, with a homestead waiting in the shadows, Silas Rourke felt the first stirring of curiosity he'd experienced since Clara died. What was this place? Who had lived here? And why had it been hidden so well that a man who'd spent his entire life in these hills had never known it existed? The rain stopped. The sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light down into the canyon. And Silas knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that everything was about to change. The first priority was shelter for Duchess. Silas walked the perimeter of the canyon, leading his injured mare carefully over the uneven ground, looking for a place where she could rest safely out of the elements. The sun was fully out now, and steam rose from the wet rocks and vegetation as the afternoon heat began to reassert itself. But nights in the high desert were cold, especially after a storm, and they needed protection. He found it on the eastern wall of the canyon, about 50 yards from the pool. A natural cave, its mouth wide enough to accommodate a horse, its interior deep enough to provide real shelter. The floor was sandy and dry, evidence that water didn't reach this far back even in heavy rains. Silas led Duchess inside and felt the temperature drop several degrees. "Perfect. You did good, girl," he said, running his hand along her neck. "You got us here. Now let me see what I can do for that leg." He unsaddled her carefully, setting his gear against the cave wall. From his saddlebag, he pulled out the small first aid kit he always carried, meant for humans, but the principles were the same. He had ibuprofen tablets that he could crush and mix with water. He had an elastic bandage. Not much, but better than nothing. Working slowly, speaking to Duchess in low, steady tones, Silas examined her leg more thoroughly. The swelling was worse now, hot and tender to the touch. She flinched when he palpated the area just above her knee, but she didn't try to pull away. Good girl, trusting girl. The injury was soft tissue, he was fairly certain. A tendon strain, maybe a partial tear. Painful and debilitating, but not permanent. Given time and rest, she'd heal. Time. That was the thing they now had in abundance, whether he wanted it or not. He wrapped her leg carefully with the elastic bandage, providing compression and support. He crushed 3 ibuprofen tablets and mixed them into a handful of grain from his saddlebag, which Duchess ate without complaint. Then he fashioned a makeshift lead rope from the spare line he carried and tied her loosely to a rock projection inside the cave, giving her enough length to move around, but keeping her from wandering off and further injuring herself. By the time he finished, the sun was angling toward late afternoon. Silas's stomach reminded him he'd skipped lunch. He pulled out the jerky from his bag and chewed it slowly, washing it down with water from his canteen that he'd refilled at the pool. His shoulder still ached from where he'd hit the ground, but the pain had settled into a dull throb he could manage. His clothes were still damp, clinging uncomfortably to his skin, but they'd dry in the warm air. He should probably stay put, rest, let Duchess recover for a day or two before attempting the journey home. The sensible thing would be to settle in here by the cave and wait. But the canyon called to him. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, now that Duchess was as comfortable as he could make her, curiosity burned in his chest like a low flame. "I'll be back before dark," he told Duchess, though she'd already lowered her head to rest. "You stay put." He walked back into the sunlight, blinking at the brightness. The canyon was perhaps 100 yards across at its widest point, and maybe twice that in length, carved deep into the surrounding hills by some ancient geological process. The waterfalls that fed the central pool came from a spring high up on the western wall, cascading down in two thin ribbons that caught the afternoon light and threw rainbows into the mist. Cottonwood trees clustered near the water, their trunks thick and gnarled with age. Between them grew willows and wild roses, all in full leaf. The grass was not uniform but grew in patches, interspersed with native plants and what looked like deliberately cultivated garden beds, now long overgrown. Someone had worked this land. Someone had planted and tended and shaped this place with intention. Silas walked slowly, his boots squelching slightly in the damp earth. Near the pool, he found what he'd thought he'd seen from a distance. A stone pathway, partially hidden by vegetation but still visible where the grass hadn't fully reclaimed it. The stones were flat and fitted together with care, not mortared but selected for their shape and laid in a pattern that spoke of skill and patience. He followed the pathway toward the southern end of the canyon, where it led to the structure he'd glimpsed earlier. As he got closer, his breath caught. It wasn't just a building. It was a homestead, complete and intact, though clearly abandoned for many years. But before he reached the cabin itself, he came to the gate. He'd passed through it in the storm, barely noticing it in his desperation to reach shelter. Now in the clear afternoon light he could see it properly. Two posts, weathered grey, but still solid, stood on either side of what would have been the main path into the canyon. Between them hung a wooden gate, its hinges rusted but still functional. The gate itself was made from split logs, carefully fitted and pegged together. But what caught Silas's attention was the carving on the crossbeam. Someone had taken time and care to chisel letters and numbers into the hard wood. The inscription was worn by decades of weather, but still legible. J.M. 1889, 1889. That was over 50 years ago. More than 50 years. Silas reached out and traced the letters with his fingertips, feeling the grooves where someone's hands had worked the wood. J.M., someone's initials. Someone who'd built this gate, marked this place as their own, claimed this hidden sanctuary. Questions tumbled through his mind. Who was J.M.? How had they found this canyon? Why had they come here, so far from any town or settlement? And what had happened to them? He pushed the gate open. It swung smoothly despite its age, the hinges protesting only slightly, and continued toward the cabin. As he walked, he noticed more evidence of habitation. A stone-lined irrigation ditch, dry now, but clearly meant to channel water from the spring to the garden areas. The remnants of what might have been a chicken coop, just a few posts and some rotted wire. A hitching post near the cabin's front entrance. The wood petrified with age, but still standing. The cabin itself was built from local stone and timber, nestled against the canyon wall as if it had grown there naturally. The roof had held up remarkably well, probably due to the protection afforded by the canyon walls and the overhang of rock above. The windows were shuttered, the door closed. It looked like the inhabitants had simply walked away one day, intending to return, and never had. Silas's hand went to the door handle, then stopped. Some instinct held him back. It felt like trespassing, like violating something sacred. The sun was getting lower, shadows lengthening across the canyon floor. He'd have to come back with a lamp or flashlight to see inside properly anyway. Instead, he circled the cabin, examining it from all angles. Single story, maybe 2 rooms, with a covered porch on the front. A root cellar entrance on the side, the wooden door partially ajar. Firewood stacked against the rear wall, so old and weathered, it would probably crumble to dust if touched. Everything spoke of lives once lived here, of daily routines and seasonal preparations, of a family making a home in this impossible place. As the sun touched the western rim of the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of gold and copper, Silas made his way back to the cave. Duchess was dozing, her weight shifted off her injured leg, and she barely stirred when he entered. He sat with his back against the cave wall, his knees drawn up, and watched the light fade from the canyon. He should have been thinking about how to get home, about the ranch waiting unattended, about the repairs and chores piling up in his absence. But his mind kept returning to that gate, those initials, that date. JM 1889, a person, a life, a mystery. Night fell, and the stars came out in brilliant profusion overhead, undimmed by any artificial light. The sound of the waterfalls was constant and soothing. Somewhere in the distance an owl called. Silas wrapped himself in his bedroll, thankfully dry, stored in a waterproof bag, and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind was too full of questions, his curiosity too awakened. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd explore more carefully. He'd look inside that cabin, search for clues about who had lived here and why. For the first time since Clara died, Silas felt a pull toward something beyond his own grief, a desire to know, to understand, to uncover a story that had been hidden for half a century. It was a small thing, maybe, but it was something, and something, after 3 years of nothing, felt like a gift he hadn't known he needed. Morning came soft and golden to the canyon. Silas woke with a stiff neck and his shoulder protesting, but his mind was clear and focused in a way it hadn't been in years. He checked on Duchess first thing. The swelling in her leg had gone down slightly, a good sign, and gave her fresh water and the last of his grain. Then, with the sun climbing over the eastern rim, he made his way to the homestead. In the fresh morning light, the cabin looked even more substantial than it had the previous evening. The stones in the walls had been carefully selected and fitted, the corners squared with skill. Someone had known what they were doing. This wasn't a temporary shelter or a line shack. This was a home, built to last. Silas stood before the door, his hand on the latch, and took a breath. Whatever he found inside would tell him something about the people who'd lived here, would show him their lives, their choices, maybe even their fate. He wasn't sure he had the right to intrude on their privacy, even after so many years. But the need to know, to understand, was stronger than his hesitation. The latch lifted easily, and the door swung inward with only a faint creak. Silas stepped across the threshold and stopped, blinking in the dimness. The interior was remarkably preserved. The canyon's dry air and the protection of the walls had prevented the worst ravages of time. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs draped from the corners, but the structure remained sound. The roof had held, keeping out the weather. No animals had nested here. The canyon was too isolated, too hard to reach. A single large room served as kitchen and living area, with a doorway at the back that led to what must have been a sleeping space. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall, its surface still holding an old kettle. A table, hand-hewn from solid wood, occupied the center of the room with 4 chairs tucked beneath it. On the table, covered in dust, sat tin plates and cups, arranged as if for a meal that had never been eaten. Silas moved slowly through the space, taking it all in. Shelves lined one wall, holding dusty jars and canisters. A spinning wheel sat in one corner, abandoned mid-project, with wool still wound around the bobbin. Pegs by the door held jackets and hats, moth-eaten now but still recognizable. Work clothes, Sunday clothes, a child's coat small and blue, his throat tightened. There had been children here, a family. He walked to the shelves and examined the items there with careful hands. A Bible, its leather cover cracked with age. A few books, practical volumes on farming and animal husbandry, one tattered novel by James Fenimore Cooper. A tobacco tin filled with buttons, a sewing basket with needles and threads still intact. The small, ordinary objects that make up a life, and then he saw it, on a shelf beside the window, catching the light that filtered through the cracks in the shutters. A wooden frame, simple but carefully made, protecting a tin daguerreotype. Silas picked it up gently, wiping the dust away with his sleeve. A family looked back at him from the photograph. The image was formal, as all photographs were in those days, the subjects posed and serious. A man in his 30s, perhaps, with a full beard and steady eyes, stood with one hand on the shoulder of a woman seated before him. She was younger, maybe late 20s, with her hair pulled back and her hands folded in her lap. Her face was lovely, despite the formal pose, with high cheekbones and intelligent eyes. 3 children completed the scene. 2 girls, maybe 8 and 10 years old, stood on either side of their parents, wearing white dresses with dark ribbons. And a boy, youngest of the 3, perhaps 5 or 6, stood in front of his father, his expression solemn and proud. They looked happy, even in the rigid formality of the photograph, even with the serious expressions required by the long exposure time. They looked content, connected, like a family that belonged together. Silas stared at the photograph for a long time, something catching in his chest. He knew this feeling. It was the same ache he felt when he looked at his own wedding photos, at the pictures of him and Clara taken over 28 years of marriage. The weight of seeing people frozen in time, unaware of what the future held. This family, posing for their portrait, had no idea they'd one day vanish without a trace. Had no idea their home would become a mystery, forgotten by the world. He set the photograph back on its shelf, careful to place it exactly where it had been, and moved deeper into the cabin. The bedroom held 2 beds, one larger for the parents, one smaller that would have been shared by the children. A trunk at the foot of the larger bed held folded clothes, surprisingly well preserved. Work shirts, a Sunday dress, children's things carefully laundered and stored. Everything was orderly. Nothing suggested a panicked departure. The dishes on the table, yes, but otherwise the cabin was neat, almost pristine. It was as if the family had simply stepped out for the day and never returned. But why? What had happened? Silas returned to the main room and stood in the center, turning slowly, trying to see what he was missing. There had to be clues here. People didn't just vanish. They left traces, hints, some indication of their intentions or their fate. The photograph drew him back. He picked it up again, studying the faces more closely. The father, J.M., presumably, the same initials on the gate, had strong features and capable hands. A working man, but educated too. You could see it in the way he held himself, in the quality of his coat. The mother looked like a woman who could handle hardship, who could make a home anywhere. And the children, their faces were soft with youth, unmarked by whatever troubles had brought their family to this hidden place. It struck Silas suddenly how much they looked like families he'd known growing up. Like his own parents, his grandparents. Good, solid people trying to build something lasting in hard country. There was nothing strange or sinister about them. They were just a family, so what had driven them here? What had made them build a home in a canyon so hidden that even the maps didn't know it existed? He thought of his own retreat into isolation after Clara died. The way he'd pulled back from community, from connection, choosing solitude over the pain of engagement. Was that what this family had done? Had they been running from something? Or had they simply wanted peace, privacy, a place where they could live on their own terms? Silas carried the photograph to the window and held it in the better light. On the back of the frame, he found something he'd missed before, an inscription, faint but legible, written in careful script. The Mercer family, summer 1891, Mercer, J.M. Joshua Mercer, perhaps. Or James, or John, but Mercer definitely. And 1891, 2 years after the date on the gate. They'd been here at least that long, maybe longer. He carefully placed the photograph back and continued his exploration. In the trunk, beneath the clothes, he found more items. A child's slate for lessons. A hand-sewn doll, simple but lovingly made. A leather pouch containing what looked like seeds saved for next year's planting, a next year that had never come. The evidence of interrupted lives was everywhere, and it broke something in Silas's heart. He understood now why he felt such a strong connection to this place. These people, the Mercers, had sought refuge here just as surely as he'd sought refuge in his own isolation. They'd built something beautiful and secret, something meant to protect them, and somehow it had failed them, or had it. He didn't know their fate. Perhaps they'd left safely. Perhaps they'd lived long lives elsewhere. Perhaps only the canyon remained as a monument to a brief chapter of their story. But he didn't think so. The orderly cabin, the preserved belongings, the sense of waiting that hung over everything, it all suggested something more final, something unresolved. As Silas stepped back outside into the morning sunlight, he made a decision. He would stay. Not just until Duchess healed enough to travel, though that was reason enough. But until he understood what had happened here, until he knew the story of the Mercer family and why they'd vanished from this place. It was the first time in 3 years that he'd committed himself to something beyond simple survival. The first time he'd felt a purpose that wasn't rooted in loss. Clara would have approved, he thought. She'd always believed in honoring the past, in preserving stories, in making sure people were remembered. "All right, Mercers," he said aloud to the empty canyon. "Let's see what you have to tell me." And with that, Silas Rourke began the work of uncovering a 50-year-old mystery, not knowing that in solving it, he might just solve the mystery of how to live again himself. Silas spent the rest of that morning making the cabin more habitable. He swept away the worst of the dust and cobwebs, opened the shutters to let in light and air, and arranged a corner where he could sleep more comfortably than in the cave. Duchess was better off where she was. The cave offered consistent temperature and protection, but Silas wanted to be closer to the source of the mystery that had taken hold of his imagination. By midday, he'd set up a small camp inside the cabin. His bedroll was spread in one corner, his saddlebag serving as a pillow. He'd cleaned the table enough to eat at and filled several jars with fresh water from the pool. The stove was still functional, though he'd need to clean the flue before risking a fire. For now, cold jerky and water would suffice. As he worked, he kept returning to look at the family photograph, as if the faces might reveal more if he studied them long enough. The Mercers, a family of 5 who'd carved out a life in this impossible place and then disappeared. What had become of them? The answer, he suspected, lay somewhere in this cabin. People left traces of themselves in their belongings, in their writings, in the objects they touched daily. Somewhere here was the story, if he could find it. He began a more systematic search, moving methodically through the cabin's contents. The bedroom yielded little beyond what he'd already found. Clothes, personal items, nothing that told him why they'd come here or what had happened to them. The kitchen area was similarly unrevealing, though he did find a larder built into the wall, its shelves still holding dusty jars of preserved food, decades past any kind of safe consumption. It was in the main room, under the window, that he found the wooden chest. It was small, maybe 2 feet long and a foot deep, made from carefully joined pine with brass hinges that had held up well. The chest had been tucked beneath a low shelf, easy to miss in the dim light. Silas knelt before it, his heart beating faster. This was different from the other items in the cabin. This was hidden, or at least not displayed. This was meant to hold something important. The lid opened smoothly, revealing contents wrapped in oiled cloth. Silas unfolded the cloth carefully and found himself looking at a leather-bound journal, its cover worn but intact. Beside it lay several loose letters, their paper brittle with age, and a small leather pouch that rattled when he lifted it. He set the letters and pouch aside and lifted the journal with reverent hands. The leather was soft and supple still, protected by the oiled cloth. On the front cover, stamped in faded gold lettering, were the words, "Daily Record." Silas carried the journal to the table and sat down in one of the chairs. Dust rose around him, caught in the afternoon sunlight. He opened the cover carefully, mindful of the brittle pages, and began to read. The first entry was dated August 15th, 1889. Written in a strong, clear hand, "We arrived at the canyon today, exhausted but grateful. The journey from Silver Creek took 6 days, traveling only at night and hiding during the day. The children bore it well, though little Thomas cried from hunger and Sarah from fear. I pray we have made the right choice. I pray this place can keep us safe until I can prove my innocence." Silas felt a chill run down his spine. Prove my innocence. So Joshua Mercer had been running from something. From the law, presumably. Falsely accused, if his words were to be believed. He read on, turning pages with careful fingers. August 20th, 1889. We have been here 5 days now. The canyon exceeds my wildest hopes. The spring provides abundant water. The soil in the cleared areas is rich, and the natural shelter is beyond anything I could have built myself. Sarah is beginning to relax, though she still startles at every sound. The children have adapted more quickly. They see it as an adventure. September 2nd, 1889. Today we planted our first crop, winter squash and late beans. It may be too late in the season, but we must try. I've set snares for rabbits and seen signs of deer. We will not starve. The canyon provides. September 15th, 1889. Margaret asked today why we couldn't go home. How do I explain to a 10-year-old that her father has been accused of theft, that men want to see him hang for a crime he did not commit? I told her we were on an extended camping trip. She's smart enough to know I'm not telling the whole truth, but she didn't press further. God bless that child's understanding heart. Silas paused, his throat tight. He could picture it too clearly. The father trying to protect his daughter's innocence, the weight of the lie necessary to preserve it. He'd seen that same protective instinct in his own father's eyes when his grandfather died. The way adults tried to shield children from harsh truths, even when the trying was futile. He continued reading, jumping ahead through the entries. October 10th, 1889. Sarah sings while she works now. That may be the best sign that we're going to be all right. Her voice echoes off the canyon walls and makes this place feel like home. November 3rd, 1889. First frost last night. The children have never seen their breath in the air before. Thomas tried to catch it in his hands. I carved them a chess set from juniper wood. Margaret is already beating me at the game. December 25th, 1889. Christmas in our hidden sanctuary. Sarah made a pudding from dried fruit and flour. We sang carols and our voices filled the canyon. I miss our church, miss our friends, miss the life we had. But I have my family and they are safe. For that, I give thanks. Entry after entry detailed the rhythm of their lives, the challenges and the small victories, the way they made a home in exile. Joshua wrote about building furniture, about teaching the children their lessons, about Sarah's garden flourishing beyond expectation. He wrote about long winter evenings by the fire, about summer days swimming in the pool, about the way the canyon changed with each season, and through it all, there was love. Joshua's love for Sarah came through in every mention of her name. His pride in his children was evident in every story he told. This wasn't a man hardened by bitterness or broken by injustice. This was a man determined to protect what mattered most. Silas found himself drawn deeper into the narrative, the hours passing without notice. He recognized something of himself in Joshua's words, in the way the man found purpose in the daily tasks of survival, in the comfort of routine and family. But he also saw the difference. Joshua had his family around him. Silas had chosen isolation. Joshua was forced into hiding by circumstances beyond his control. Silas had built his own prison from grief. The light was fading when Silas reached an entry that made him sit up straighter. June 14th, 1892. 3 years we've been here. 3 years of waiting for word that it's safe to return. I've sent 2 letters to my brother in Denver, asking him to investigate my case, to find evidence of my innocence. No replies have come. Either he's abandoned us, or the letters have been intercepted. I don't know which possibility is worse. So Joshua had tried to communicate with the outside world, had tried to find a way back to his old life. Silas felt a surge of sympathy for the man. 3 years of isolation, even with his family, even in this beautiful place. It must have worn on him. The later entries grew darker in tone. August 8th, 1892. Sarah fears we'll spend the rest of our lives here. She says it with a smile, trying to make it sound like acceptance rather than resignation. But I hear the longing in her voice when she talks about her mother, about the friends she left behind. The children are growing up wild, free, but uneducated beyond what we can teach them. Is this the life I wanted for them? Is safety worth this price? October 20th, 1892. I've decided I must return to Silver Creek, if only to learn what's happened, to see if there's any chance of clearing my name. I'll go alone, traveling fast and careful. If I'm caught, at least Sarah and the children will be safe here. If I succeed, we can go home. And then, a few pages later, an entry that made Silas's blood run cold. November 5th, 1892. I made it to Silver Creek 2 days ago. Hid on the outskirts, watching, listening. The Deputy Marshal, Thomas Hadley, is still there. Still wearing his badge. Still celebrated as the man who ran off the thief, Joshua Mercer. No one mentions my innocence. No one questions the charges. I watched my old life from the shadows and realized there's nothing to go back to. Tomorrow I return to the canyon, to my family, to the only life we have left. But beneath that entry, scrawled in a shakier hand, As if written in haste or fear, November 8th, 1892. Someone followed me back. I'm certain of it. Saw a rider on the ridge this morning. Don't know if he saw the canyon entrance, but we can't risk staying. Must move the family tonight to the north cave we prepared for emergencies. Pray we're being overcautious. Pray it's nothing. But I won't gamble with their lives. And that was the last entry in the journal. Silas sat back, his hands trembling slightly. November 8th, 1892, 53 years ago. Joshua had believed someone had followed him, had discovered their hiding place. He'd planned to evacuate the family to some kind of emergency shelter, but what had happened then? Had they made it to safety? Had they been caught? The journal ended at the moment of crisis, leaving everything unresolved. Silas looked at the letters he'd set aside earlier, at the leather pouch he hadn't yet opened. More answers waited there, he suspected. But the light was nearly gone, and his eyes were tired from reading the faded script. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd read the rest. Tomorrow he'd find out what happened to the Mercer family. But as he lay down to sleep that night, the journal on the table beside him, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. That somehow, across 5 decades, the Mercers were reaching out to him, asking him to understand, to remember, to bear witness to what they'd endured, and he would. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would uncover their story and make sure it wasn't forgotten. Morning brought clarity to the canyon, the kind of perfect light that makes everything seem freshly created. Silas woke early, his body adjusting to the rhythms of this place, and immediately thought of the letters he hadn't yet read, the pouch he hadn't opened. But something else drew him first, the bedroom, the children's beds. He'd looked in there before, but only briefly, cataloguing contents without really seeing them. Now, with Joshua's journal fresh in his mind, with the knowledge of Margaret and little Thomas and the unnamed third child, he wanted to understand their lives more completely. The smaller bed was narrow, meant for children to share. Against the wall beside it stood a simple shelf holding a few treasures. A wooden horse, hand-carved with surprising detail. A collection of interesting stones, rose quartz, fool's gold, a piece of petrified wood. A small slate with multiplication tables written in chalk, faded but still visible, and tucked in the corner of the bed, almost hidden by the pillow, a doll. Silas picked it up carefully. It was made from flour sacks, the fabric faded but still intact, sewn with small, careful stitches. The stuffing was dried grass, compressed by time but holding its shape. Someone had embroidered a simple face, 2 eyes, a nose, a smiling mouth. The hair was made from unraveled rope, braided and attached to the scalp. A small dress, also made from flour sack material, had been carefully sewn to fit. The workmanship was impressive. Every stitch was straight and even, showing patience and skill. This wasn't hastily made. This was a labor of love, probably created over many evenings by lamplight. Silas could picture it. The mother teaching the daughter, their heads bent together over the fabric. The quiet conversation of women's work. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding the doll, and felt something break loose in his chest. This simple toy, crafted from scraps and hope, represented everything the Mercers had tried to build here. A normal childhood for their children, despite the fear and isolation. A sense of home and comfort and continuity, even while hiding from the law. It reminded him too sharply of conversations he'd had with Clara about children. They'd tried for years, had hoped and been disappointed more times than he could count. Eventually they'd accepted it would be just the 2 of them, had made peace with that reality. But he wondered sometimes what Clara would have made, what small treasures she would have crafted if they'd had a daughter to sew for. He set the doll back exactly where he'd found it, his hands gentle, as if the child who'd loved it might return any moment. Then he returned to the main room, to the chest, to the letters and pouch waiting there. The letters were written in a different hand than Joshua's, smaller, more delicate, with elegant loops and careful spacing. Sarah's hand, almost certainly. There were 5 of them, each dated and addressed to Mother, though clearly never sent. Silas arranged them in chronological order and began to read. September 20th, 1889. Dearest Mother, I miss you more than words can express. I know you must worry about us, about where we've gone and why. Joshua tells me it's safer this way, that telling you the truth would put you in danger too. But it breaks my heart to think of you believing we simply abandoned you. Please know that wherever we are, whatever has happened, you are in my thoughts every day. The children ask about you constantly. I tell them stories about your garden, about the pies you used to make, about the way you sang in church. I hope someday we can return and you can make new memories with your grandchildren. Until then, know that you are loved. Your devoted daughter Sarah. The letter was stained with water. Tears, Silas realized. Old tears, dried decades ago, but still visible in the way the ink had run slightly at the bottom of the page. He read through the other letters, each one a window into Sarah's heart. She wrote about the children's progress in their lessons, about teaching Margaret to sew and cook, about Thomas's boundless energy and curiosity. She wrote about the garden, about recipes she'd adapted to their limited ingredients, about the small ways she tried to maintain civilized life in their wilderness refuge. But beneath the domestic details, he could sense her loneliness. The weight of isolation pressed through every line, despite her efforts to remain positive. She missed her mother. She missed her friends from church. She missed being able to walk into town and buy fabric or exchange gossip or attend a social gathering. One passage in particular caught his attention. April 3rd, 1891. Mother, I sometimes wonder if we made the right choice in running. Joshua was innocent. I know this in my bones. But would it have been better to stay and face the false charges? At least then we'd have had a community around us, people who knew Joshua's character. Out here we have only each other. The children are growing up without playmates, without the normal experiences of childhood. Margaret should be attending school, making friends her own age. Instead, she helps me with the cooking and tends the garden like a small adult. Is this the life I wanted for my children? Then a few lines later, but when I see Joshua with them teaching Thomas to fish or showing Margaret the constellations, I remember why we came. Man's freedom, his very life was at stake. What mother wouldn't flee to protect her children's father? What wife wouldn't choose exile over execution? We did what we had to do, and if God is merciful, someday we'll be vindicated and can return to the world. Silas set the letter down, his vision blurred. Sarah's courage, her faith in her husband despite everything, moved him profoundly. She'd given up everything, her mother, her community, her entire life, to follow Joshua into hiding. That kind of devotion, that depth of commitment was rare. Clara had shown him that same devotion. When he'd wanted to leave the city and return to ranch life, she'd supported him without hesitation, even though it meant leaving her teaching position and the friends she'd made. When the cancer came, when the treatments made her weak and sick, she'd apologized to him for being a burden. As if loving her could ever be a burden. He picked up another letter, this one dated October 15th, 1891. Mother, today I taught Margaret to sew a doll. She wanted one so desperately, but of course we have no store to purchase such things. So I showed her how to use flour sacks and dried grass, how to make something from nothing. She worked for hours, her little tongue poking out in concentration, the way mine used to when you taught me to sew. When she finished, she was so proud. She named the doll Annabelle, and has barely put it down since. These small joys sustain us. These moments of normalcy remind us that we're still a family, still whole, even if we're hidden away from the world. So the doll had a name, Annabelle, and Margaret had made it herself under her mother's patient guidance. Silas thought of the doll lying on the bed, waiting all these years for the child who'd loved it, waiting for Margaret Mercer, who would be in her 60s now if she was still alive, if that was the question that haunted him. What had happened to this family? The journal had ended with Joshua's warning that someone had followed him, that they needed to evacuate. But there was no sign of violence in the cabin, no indication of struggle or forced departure. Everything was orderly, preserved, as if they'd simply walked away. Had they made it to safety? Had they escaped whoever was pursuing them? Silas spent the rest of the day reading and rereading the letters, comparing them to Joshua's journal entries, trying to piece together a complete picture of their lives. By evening, he felt he knew the Mercers as well as he'd known his own neighbors back when he still talked to neighbors. He knew Joshua's steadfast determination, Sarah's quiet strength, the children's resilience and innocence. He also knew they'd loved each other deeply, had built something precious in this hidden place, something worth protecting. As the sun set, Silas checked on Duchess. Her leg was continuing to heal, the swelling reduced to almost nothing. She could probably walk now, could probably make the journey home if they took it slow, but Silas didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not until he knew the end of the story. He returned to the cabin and built a small fire in the stove, having cleaned the flue that afternoon. The warmth was welcome as the desert night cooled around him. He sat at the table with both journals, Joshua's and the letters Sarah had written but never sent, and read by firelight, absorbing their words, their hopes, their fears. Outside, the canyon was peaceful. The waterfalls whispered their constant song. Stars emerged overhead in brilliant profusion. And Silas Rourke, alone in a cabin that hadn't housed life in over 50 years, felt less alone than he had in the 3 years since Clara died. The Mercers had become real to him. Their story mattered, and somehow, reading their words, understanding their struggles, he began to understand something about his own life. They'd been forced to hide, to withdraw from the world. He'd chosen it. They'd longed to return to their community. He'd been avoiding his. They'd found purpose in protecting each other, in building a life despite hardship. He'd been merely existing, going through motions, waiting for nothing. Clara wouldn't have wanted this for him. Just as Sarah had worried about her children growing up isolated, Clara had worried about him shutting down after she was gone. She'd made him promise to keep living, to stay connected, to find meaning in his days. He'd failed her in that. But maybe, just maybe, uncovering the Mercer's story was a first step toward keeping that promise, toward finding his way back to the world of the living. Tomorrow, he'd open the leather pouch and read whatever else the chest held. Tomorrow, he'd continue piecing together what had happened to this family. But tonight, he'd sit with their words and their memory, and let their story work its slow magic on his grieving heart. The leather pouch yielded little of interest, just coins, old currency that would be worth something to a collector, but told Silas nothing about the Mercer's fate. He set it aside and focused on the cabin itself, convinced there had to be more. People didn't live in a place for 3 years without leaving deeper traces of themselves. He'd been examining the floorboards near the stove, looking for any kind of hidden compartment or loose board where valuables might be stored, when he noticed something odd. One plank, about 2 feet from the wall, sat slightly higher than its neighbors. Not by much, maybe a 1/4 inch. But enough to catch his eye in the morning light slanting through the window. Silas knelt and ran his fingers along the board's edge. It was definitely loose. He worked his knife blade into the gap and gently pried upward. The board came free easily, as if it had been removed and replaced many times. Beneath it, in the dark space between the floor and the earth, sat a small metal box. His heart began to beat faster. This was it. This was what he'd been looking for. Whatever the Mercers had deemed most important, most secret, would be here. The box was tin, the kind that might have once held tea or tobacco, its surface spotted with rust but still intact. Silas lifted it carefully, mindful of its age and fragility. It was heavier than he expected, solid with contents. He carried it to the table, sat down, and took a breath before opening it. Somehow he knew that what he found inside would change everything. The lid opened with a faint squeal of protesting metal. Inside, wrapped in oiled paper to protect it from moisture, lay a folded document. Beside it, tarnished, nearly black with age, was a star-shaped metal badge. Silas's hands shook as he lifted the badge into the light. He rubbed at the tarnish with his thumb, revealing engraving underneath. Deputy Marshal, Silver Creek District. A lawman's badge. But why would the Mercers have it? Joshua had been running from the law, not serving it. He set the badge aside and carefully unfolded the document. The paper was brittle, threatening to crack at the creases, so he worked slowly, gently. When it was finally open, he saw it was a letter, written in a cramped, hurried hand quite different from either Joshua's or Sarah's. The date at the top made him freeze. February 17th, 1893. 3 months after Joshua's last journal entry. 3 months after the Mercers had presumably fled the canyon, Silas began to read, and with each line, his understanding of everything shifted. To the sheriff of Silver Creek and all concerned parties, I, Thomas Wesley Hadley, Deputy Marshal of the Silver Creek District, being of sound mind but failing body, do hereby confess to crimes that have weighed upon my conscience these 4 years past. In the spring of 1889, I discovered irregularities in the assay office accounts. Gold was disappearing from the deposits, small amounts at first, then larger sums. I investigated quietly, not wanting to cause alarm without proof. What I found was my own superior, Marshal Dalton Creed, skimming from the deposits for his personal gain. Marshal Creed discovered my investigation before I could gather sufficient evidence to charge him. He threatened my life and the lives of my family if I spoke. More than that, he had the power to ruin me, to brand me as the thief rather than him. In my cowardice and fear, I agreed to his plan. We would frame an innocent man for the theft, a man with access to the assay office, a man whose word would not carry weight against a marshal's. That man was Joshua Mercer, bookkeeper and honest to a fault. We doctored the accounts to show a pattern of theft coinciding with Mercer's shifts. We planted evidence in his home, small amounts of gold dust, transfer documents with forged signatures. It was thoroughly done. No one questioned our findings. Mercer's protests of innocence were dismissed as the desperate lies of a guilty man. He fled before we could arrest him, disappeared with his family. At the time, I told myself this was better. If he was gone, we wouldn't have to see him hang for our crimes. But the truth is, I was relieved. His absence meant I wouldn't have to face him, wouldn't have to look into the eyes of a man I'd destroyed. Marshal Creed died last year, thrown from his horse while drunk. I thought his death might ease my conscience, but it hasn't. If anything, the weight grows heavier. I'm dying now. The doctor gives me perhaps 2 months, and I cannot meet my Maker with this on my soul. Joshua Mercer is innocent, completely wholly innocent. He had no part in the theft. I destroyed his life, his reputation, his peace, for my own craven fear. His children lost their home. His wife lost her standing in the community. And I did this. Not Marshal Creed alone, but me, Thomas Hadley, who was supposed to uphold the law. If Joshua Mercer still lives, he deserves to know his name is cleared. If he has died in exile, his family deserves to know he was innocent. I know this confession cannot undo the harm I've caused, but it is all I have left to offer. I have placed my badge with this letter as a symbol of my shame. I do not deserve to wear it. I never did. May God have mercy on my soul. For I have little myself. Thomas Wesley Hadley, former Deputy Marshal, February 17th, 1893. Silas read the letter twice, then a third time, making sure he understood. Then he sat back in his chair, the paper trembling in his hands, and tried to process what this meant. Joshua Mercer had been innocent, completely innocent, just as he'd claimed. He'd been framed by corrupt lawmen who'd needed a scapegoat for their own crimes. And he'd spent 3 years hiding in this canyon, protecting his family from a threat based entirely on lies. But more than that, more devastating than that, Hadley had written this confession 3 months after the Mercers disappeared, which meant Joshua's name had been cleared. The truth had been documented, preserved, waiting to exonerate him, but the confession had never been delivered. Hadley must have died before he could get it to the proper authorities. Or perhaps he'd hidden it, still too cowardly even in his final days to face the consequences of revealing his crimes. Either way, the confession had ended up here, in the Mercer's cabin, which meant Silas's thoughts raced. How had it gotten here? The last journal entry was from November 1892. Hadley had written his confession in February 1893. Someone must have found this document and brought it to the canyon, looking for the Mercers to tell them they were free to return. But the cabin was abandoned, preserved exactly as the family had left it. So they'd never received the news, never knew they were exonerated, never learned they could go home. The tragedy of it was almost unbearable. Joshua and Sarah had sacrificed everything, their home, their community, their entire lives, to protect their family from false charges. They'd built this sanctuary, had hidden here for 3 years, had endured isolation and hardship. And all the while, they could have proven Joshua's innocence if they'd only waited a little longer. No, Silas corrected himself. They couldn't have waited. By November 1892, Joshua had tried to return to Silver Creek and found nothing had changed. Hadley was still wearing his badge, still celebrated. There was no indication the truth would ever come out. The Mercers had made the only choice they could with the information they had, but the irony was crushing nonetheless. 3 months. 3 months after they'd fled the canyon, fearing discovery, the truth had finally emerged. Too late. Silas looked at the badge again, that tarnished symbol of authority and betrayal. Hadley had included it with his confession, giving up the position he'd dishonored. An empty gesture, really. Nothing could undo the harm he'd caused. Nothing could give the Mercers back the years they'd lost. But at least now Silas knew the truth. Knew that Joshua had been the good man his journals suggested. Knew that the Mercers had been victims of corruption, not criminals running from justice. The question remained, though, what had happened to them after they left? Joshua's last entry had been filled with fear, with the certainty that someone had followed him back to the canyon. He'd planned to evacuate his family to an emergency shelter in the North Cave. But then what? Had they escaped? Had they built a new life somewhere else under assumed names? Or had something worse happened? Silas stood and paced the cabin, his mind working through the possibilities. The orderly state of the homestead suggested they'd left in a hurry, but not in panic. They'd taken time to close shutters, to bank the fire, to store things properly, which meant they'd made it out safely, at least initially. But where had they gone? And why had they never returned, even to collect their belongings? He looked at the map fragment he'd found earlier, the one Sarah had sketched on the back of a letter, showing trails out of the canyon and a location marked Safe Cave North Ridge. That had to be where they'd gone. Their emergency shelter, the place they'd prepared for exactly this kind of situation. Silas made a decision. He would find that cave. He would follow the Mercers' path and discover what had happened to them. He owed them that much. After reading their journals, their letters, after coming to know them so intimately, he couldn't just walk away without knowing their fate. They'd been real people with real lives, real hopes and fears and loves. They deserved to be remembered, to have their story told, to have their innocence proclaimed, even if it was half a century too late. He carefully refolded Hadley's confession and placed it back in the metal box, along with the badge. These items were evidence, proof of Joshua's innocence. Someday, when Silas returned to civilization, he'd make sure they reached the proper authorities. Joshua Mercer's name would be cleared officially. The historical record would be corrected. But first, he had to find out what had happened to the family. Had to follow their escape route to its end. Had to know if they'd made it to safety or if something had stopped them. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and warm. Silas walked to the cave where Duchess waited. The mare's leg had healed remarkably well. She could bear weight on it now, could walk without significant limping. In another day or two, she'd be ready for the journey home. But Silas wasn't going home. Not yet. Tomorrow he'd follow the map Sarah had drawn. He'd climb to the North Ridge and find the safe cave. He'd uncover the rest of the Mercer's story, and maybe in doing so, he'd uncover something about himself as well. About resilience and survival, about protecting what mattered, about the difference between running from life and fighting for it. The Mercers had fought. Even in exile, even in fear, they'd built something beautiful together. They'd created a home, raised their children, loved each other through hardship. Silas had merely been surviving, existing, waiting for time to dull the pain of Clara's absence. But the Mercers were teaching him something different, showing him that even when life strips everything away, even when you're hiding in a canyon from forces beyond your control, you can still choose to build rather than surrender. You can still find purpose and meaning and love. Tomorrow, he'd continue their story. Tonight, he'd honor their memory by reading their words one more time, by bearing witness to what they'd endured. And when he finally left this canyon, whenever that might be, he'd carry their story with him. He'd make sure Joshua Mercer's name was cleared, that their sacrifice was acknowledged, that they were remembered as the brave, loving family they'd been. It was the least he could do. And perhaps, in doing it, he'd find his own path back to living. Silas woke before dawn, his mind already racing through what he needed to do. The map fragment showed a trail leading north from the canyon, climbing up through a series of switchbacks to a ridge where the safe cave was marked. It looked to be a challenging climb, maybe 3 or 4 miles of steep terrain, but manageable for a man in decent shape. He'd been in this canyon for 5 days now. 5 days of reading journals and letters, of piecing together the Mercers' lives, of becoming invested in their story. Some distant, rational part of his mind whispered that he should go home, that Duchess was healed enough to travel, that his ranch needed attention, that bills needed paying, that the world would start wondering where he'd gone, but he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without knowing what had happened to this family, who'd captured his heart across the span of 53 years. He made careful preparations, filled his canteen with fresh water, packed jerky and some of the wild berries he'd found growing near the pool, made sure he had matches, his knife, basic first aid supplies. Most importantly, he had Clara's compass and the map Sarah had drawn. Before leaving, he spent time with Duchess, checking her leg one more time, making sure she had water and access to the good grass growing near the cave entrance. "I'll be back before dark," he told her, running his hand down her face. "You stay here and rest that leg." "We're not quite done here yet." The mare nickered softly and bumped his hand with her nose. She seemed content, no longer in pain, healing well. In a way, their forced stay in this canyon had been good for both of them. Duchess had gotten the rest she needed, and Silas had found something he didn't know he'd been looking for. The trail north began just beyond the wooden gate. Sarah's map showed it starting near a distinctive split juniper tree, and Silas found the tree easily, its trunk divided into a perfect V about 4 feet off the ground. Someone, Joshua probably, had cut a small mark into the bark, an arrow pointing up the slope. A trail marker subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking for it. Silas began to climb. The path was faint, overgrown with decades of neglect, but still discernible if you knew where to look. Joshua had chosen the route well, using natural features to minimize the difficulty. It followed a shallow drainage for the first half-mile, then cut across the slope at an angle, zigzagging back and forth to reduce the grade. The morning was cool, perfect for hiking, and Silas found a rhythm in the climb. His knees protested the steep sections, and his shoulder, still tender from his fall during the storm, ached with the effort. But the pain felt good, felt real. He was doing something, working towards something. That was more than he could say about the last 3 years of his life. As he climbed higher, the canyon falling away below him, Silas let his thoughts wander. He'd been asking himself why this mattered so much. Why he cared so deeply about the fate of people he'd never met, a family that had disappeared before he was born. Part of it, he knew, was simple human curiosity. A mystery begged to be solved. But it was more than that. Something about the Mercer's story had reached into his chest and grabbed hold of something he thought had died with Clara. They'd been hiding too. Just like him. They'd withdrawn from the world, built walls around themselves, chosen isolation over the risk of connection. But their isolation had been forced upon them. They'd made the best of it, yes, had created something beautiful in this canyon, but they'd longed to return to their community. Had written letters they couldn't send, had kept journals documenting their exile, had never stopped hoping for vindication. Silas had chosen his isolation, had actively pushed people away, had let his grief become a fortress that kept out not just pain, but also possibility. The Mercers would have given anything to be able to walk back into their community, to reclaim their lives. He had that option every single day and refused it. He paused about halfway up the ridge, breathing hard, and looked back at the canyon spread below him. From this height he could see the whole thing, the waterfall, the pool, the homestead tucked against the western wall, the cave where Duchess rested. It was beautiful, a perfect sanctuary. But it was also a prison in its way, a gilded cage for a family who deserved so much more. Clara's voice came to him then, as clear as if she were standing beside him. a memory from those last weeks in the hospital, when they both knew the end was near. She'd taken his hand, her grip weak but determined, and made him look at her. "Promise me something," she'd said, her voice raspy from the oxygen tube. "Promise me you won't shut down when I'm gone." "Clara," he'd started, but she'd squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "No, listen. I know you. I know you'll want to pull back to hide in your grief. But that's not living, Silas. That's just waiting to die." Her eyes had been fierce, burning with an intensity that belied her failing body. "You have to stay connected. To people, to community, to life. Promise me," he'd promised. Promised through tears, promised with every intention of keeping his word. But then she died, and the weight of his grief had been so overwhelming that all he'd wanted was to be left alone. To not have to pretend he was okay. To not have to see the pity in people's eyes, or hear the platitudes about time healing all wounds. So he'd broken his promise, had retreated to the ranch and stayed there, had let his friends drift away, had stopped returning phone calls, had turned down invitations until people stopped inviting him. He'd told himself it was what he needed. That grief required solitude, but the truth was, he'd been hiding, just like the Mercers, except his exile was self-imposed. And unlike them, he had no good reason for it. No false charges, no threat to his life, just fear. Fear of facing the world without Clara beside him. Fear of moving forward when moving forward felt like leaving her behind. The Mercers had shown him the difference. They'd been forced into hiding, but had never stopped wanting to return. Had never given up hope of reclaiming their lives. They'd built something in exile, yes, but always with an eye towards someday being free to leave. Silas had built nothing. Had just marked time, day after day, month after month, year after year. He'd maintained the ranch because routine demanded it, but he hadn't lived. Not really. He'd been surviving, and poorly at that. What would Clara think if she could see him now? Would she be disappointed in how thoroughly he'd broken his promise? Or would she understand? Would she forgive him the way she'd always forgiven his failings? He wanted to believe she'd understand, but he also knew, with the certainty that comes from 28 years of marriage, what she'd want him to do now. She'd want him to keep climbing, to find the answers he was seeking, and then to go home and start actually living again. The thought was terrifying. After 3 years of isolation, the prospect of rejoining his community felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. But maybe that's what it took. Maybe you had to find yourself at the edge, with nowhere left to hide, before you could choose to step forward. Silas resumed climbing. The trail grew steeper, more challenging. Loose rocks shifted under his boots, and he had to use his hands in places, grabbing onto roots and rock projections to pull himself up. Sweat soaked his shirt, despite the cool morning air. His legs burned with effort, but he kept going, higher and higher, following Sarah's careful map, watching for the landmarks she'd noted. A lightning-struck pine, an outcrop shaped like a bear's head, a spring trickling down through moss-covered rocks. The ridgetop, when he finally reached it, was a narrow spine of rock running north-south along the canyon's eastern wall. The view was spectacular, miles of empty desert stretching in all directions, broken only by the occasional ridge or valley. From here, you could see why the Mercers had never been found. This country was vast and unforgiving. 100 canyons could hide families, and no one would ever know. Sarah's map indicated the safe cave was about a quarter-mile north along the ridge, in an area where the rock face was broken and fissured. Silas walked carefully, mindful of loose stones and sudden drop-offs. The wind was stronger up here, cold and steady, carrying the scent of sage and stone. He almost missed the cave entrance. It was hidden behind a jumble of boulders, visible only from a specific angle. But there, just as Sarah had drawn it, was the opening, low and narrow, barely big enough for an adult to squeeze through. But something else caught his attention. The ground in front of the entrance was disturbed, the earth darker than the surrounding rock. And nearby, a section of the hillside showed clear signs of an old rockfall. Boulders that didn't quite match the surrounding geology, piled in a way that suggested they'd come from above, tumbling down the slope. Silas's heart began to beat faster. A rockfall. Something had triggered a rockfall here, probably decades ago. Was this what had happened to the Mercers? Had they taken shelter in the cave only to be trapped by falling rock? He approached the entrance carefully, looking for any sign of recent disturbance, though recent was relative when you were investigating something from 50 years ago. The boulders blocking part of the entrance were large, several 100 pounds each. It would have taken significant force to dislodge them, an earthquake perhaps, or heavy rain undermining the hillside, or someone deliberately triggering a collapse. That thought stopped him cold. Joshua's last journal entry had mentioned someone following him. What if that someone had tracked the family here? What if they'd waited until the Mercers took shelter in the cave and then deliberately caused a rockfall? It seemed far-fetched. But then again, corrupt lawmen had already framed an innocent man and destroyed his life. Was murder really that much further outside the realm of possibility? Silas pulled out his flashlight, a small one he kept in his saddlebag for emergencies, and clicked it on. The beam was strong enough to penetrate the darkness beyond the entrance. He took a breath, steadying himself for what he might find, and began to work his way through the opening. The passage was tight, forcing him to turn sideways and shuffle through. Loose rock shifted under his feet, and for a moment he wondered if he was about to trigger another collapse. But the passage held, and he emerged into a larger chamber beyond. His flashlight beams swept across the space, revealing a natural cave perhaps 15 feet across and 8 feet high. And there, against the far wall, arranged in a careful line, were 4 objects that made his breath catch in his throat. 4 bedrolls, old moth-eaten but still recognizable. 4 places where the Mercer family had intended to sleep to wait out whatever danger pursued them, but the bedrolls were empty, undisturbed. If the family had made it here, they hadn't stayed long. And if they'd been trapped by the rockfall, their remains would be here. Silas moved deeper into the cave, his flashlight searching every shadow. There had to be something else, some clue about what had happened next. And then he saw it, a narrow passage at the back of the cave, easily missed in the darkness. A natural tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. This wasn't a dead end. This was an escape route. The Mercers had thought of everything. They'd prepared for the possibility of being trapped, had found a cave with not just shelter, but a way through to the other side. Joshua hadn't been a man who left things to chance. Silas approached the tunnel entrance, his excitement building. If he followed this passage through, if he found where it emerged on the other side, he might finally discover what had happened to the family. The answer was close. He could feel it. After days of searching, after reading their journals and letters, after coming to know them so intimately, he was finally approaching the end of their story, and his own story, he realized, was somehow tied up in theirs. Whatever he found on the other side of this mountain, whatever the Mercers' ultimate fate, would tell him something about his own choices, his own exile, his own path forward. He checked his watch. Still plenty of daylight left. Duchess was safe in the canyon below. He had water and supplies. There was no reason not to continue. Silas took a breath, aimed his flashlight into the darkness, and stepped into the tunnel. The tunnel was narrow, forcing Silas to crouch as he moved forward. His flashlight beam revealed rough stone walls, worn smooth in places by ancient water flow. This passage had been carved by nature over millennia, a secret route through the heart of the mountain that the Mercers had somehow discovered. He moved slowly, testing each step before committing his weight. The floor was uneven, sloping downward at first, then leveling out. In places, he had to turn sideways to squeeze through tight spots. The air was cool and smelled of stone and earth, utterly still, without even the whisper of wind that had been constant on the ridge. His knee bumped against something, and he stopped, angling his light downward. There, half buried in dust and small rocks, was a tin cup, old dented but unmistakably the kind of vessel someone would carry for drinking. Silas picked it up carefully, turning it in his hands. No markings, nothing to identify it specifically as belonging to the Mercers, but the timing felt right. The location felt right. They'd come through here. He was certain of it now. He continued forward, his excitement building despite the claustrophobic confines of the tunnel. Every few yards he found more evidence. A scrap of fabric caught on a sharp projection of rock, faded blue, possibly from a child's dress. A length of rope, ancient and frayed, tied to a stone protrusion, as if someone had used it for support or guidance in the darkness. The passage widened slightly, and Silas could stand upright again. His back appreciated the relief. How long was this tunnel? Sarah's map hadn't shown scale, just the basic route. He could be 10 yards from the exit or 100. No way to know, except to keep going. Then his flashlight caught something that made his heart skip. There, on a flat rock that served as a natural shelf, sat 3 items arranged in a deliberate line. A water skin, leather cracked with age, but still holding its shape. A small leather pouch, similar to the one he'd found in the cabin, and a blanket, folded neatly despite decades of dust. This had been a rest stop, a place where the family had paused during their escape, had organized their supplies, had taken a moment to gather themselves before continuing. Silas opened the pouch, careful with the brittle leather. Inside were more coins, emergency funds probably, and something else. A small book of matches so old the wood had petrified, and tucked beneath them a piece of paper folded small. He unfolded it gently, almost afraid it would crumble at his touch. It was a note written in Sarah's hand. The ink faded but still legible in the flashlight's beam. If anyone finds this, know that we made it this far safely. November 9th, 1892. The children are frightened but brave. Joshua believes the passage will take us to the Eastern Valley. We will make our way from there. Pray for us. S.M. November 9th, 1892, the day after Joshua's last journal entry. They'd spent the night in the safe cave and started through the tunnel the next morning. And Sarah had left this note like a breadcrumb trail, a message in a bottle for whoever might come looking. 53 years later, Silas had found it. Relief flooded through him so powerfully his legs felt weak. They'd made it this far. The family wasn't trapped, wasn't buried under the rockfall. They'd found the tunnel and used it, just as they'd planned. But where had they gone after emerging on the other side? That question still remained. Silas tucked the note carefully into his shirt pocket and continued forward. The tunnel began to slope upward now, a steady climb that made his legs burn. In one section, he had to crawl on hands and knees, the ceiling so low it brushed his back. Claustrophobia threatened for a moment. The weight of the mountain above him, the narrow confines, the darkness broken only by his flashlight beam. But he pushed through it. If the Mercers could do this with young children in tow, he could manage it alone. More evidence appeared as he progressed. A child's shoe, tiny and worn, its mate lost somewhere in the darkness. It brought tears to his eyes, the image of little Thomas or one of the girls losing a shoe in their desperate flight, too frightened or too focused on survival to stop and retrieve it. Another scrap of fabric. More rope marks on the walls where someone had guided themselves through. And then, as the tunnel began to brighten with natural light ahead, one more discovery that stopped him in his tracks. A locket. Silver, tarnished nearly black, lying on the ground as if dropped. The chain was broken, suggesting it had been torn from someone's neck, caught on rock perhaps, or pulled loose in the desperate navigation of the tunnel. Silas picked it up with shaking hands and worked the catch open. Inside were 4 tiny photographs, the kind made for lockets, each one barely bigger than a thumbnail. 3 children's faces, Margaret, the middle girl, and Thomas, looked out at him from the past. And in the 4th frame, a lock of dark hair, carefully curled and preserved. Joshua's hair, almost certainly. A keepsake Sarah had carried with her, a physical reminder of her husband close to her heart. She must have been devastated when she realized she'd lost it. Must have wanted to turn back, to search, but couldn't risk it with her children's safety at stake. So she'd continued forward, leaving this piece of her heart in the darkness, hoping someday to return and reclaim it, but she never had. Silas closed the locket and placed it carefully in his pocket alongside the note. These items would go with him when he left the canyon. They belonged with the journals and letters, with Hadley's confession and the badge. They were part of the Mercers' story, evidence of their courage and their sacrifice. The tunnel's exit was close now. He could see daylight ahead, could feel the faint movement of air. A dozen more yards, and he'd emerge on the other side of the mountain, would see where the Mercers had gone after their escape. His heart pounded with anticipation and something close to dread. What would he find? Some sign of their fate? Or just more questions? He crawled through the final narrow section, his shoulders scraping rock on both sides, and emerged into brilliant sunlight that made him squint and raise his hand to shade his eyes. When his vision adjusted, when he could finally see clearly, he found himself standing on a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley he'd never seen before. The terrain was different from the high desert he knew. Slightly lower elevation, with more vegetation, a creek visible in the distance. And below him, perhaps a quarter-mile down the slope, was a town, or what had been a town once. Even from this distance, Silas could see the buildings were abandoned, falling into ruin. A ghost town, forgotten by time. But there, on a flat piece of ground near what looked like an old cemetery, something caught the light. Something metallic, deliberately placed. Silas's breath caught. He knew somehow that whatever waited down there would answer his questions. Would tell him finally what had become of the Mercer family after they'd escaped through the mountain. The sun was past its zenith now, afternoon shadows lengthening. He should turn back, should return to Duchess before dark, but he couldn't, not when he was this close. Not when the end of the story was literally within reach. He checked his water, half a canteen left. Enough. He had a couple hours of daylight remaining. Enough time to reach the town, investigate, and start back. Silas began picking his way down the slope toward the ghost town, toward the answers that had waited 53 years for someone to find them. The ghost town revealed itself slowly as Silas descended. What had looked like a single street from above was actually a small settlement, maybe 20 buildings in various states of collapse. A general store with its false front leaning at a precarious angle. A livery stable, its roof caved in. A church with broken windows and a cross that had fallen to lie beside the door. This had been a mining town, Silas realized, as he walked down what used to be the main street. The telltale signs were everywhere, mine tailings on the hillsides, rusted equipment half buried in sage, the cramped arrangement of buildings that spoke of boom times when land was valuable and everyone wanted to be close to the action. But the boom had gone bust, as it always did. The ore had played out, or the price had dropped, and the people had moved on to the next opportunity, the next promise of wealth. Now only the wind moved through these streets, rattling loose boards and stirring up dust. Silas walked toward the cemetery he'd spotted from above. It was on the eastern edge of town, a small plot of land enclosed by a low stone wall. The gate had long since fallen away, but the wall remained, marking the boundary between the living world and the dead, or the once living world and the dead. This whole town was a graveyard of sorts. The cemetery held perhaps 30 markers, most of them simple wooden crosses that had weathered to grey splinters. A few stone markers remained, their inscriptions barely legible. Silas read the names and dates as he walked among them. Miners, mostly. Men who died young in accidents or disease. A few women, probably wives, who'd followed their husbands into this hard country. Several small graves that made his chest tight. Children who hadn't survived the harsh conditions, and there, in the far corner, stood 4 markers that were different from the rest. Newer once, 50 years ago. Stone markers, carefully carved, still standing straight despite decades of weather. Silas's footsteps slowed as he approached. His heart knew what he was going to find before his eyes confirmed it. The first marker read, Joshua David Mercer, 1858-1903. Beloved husband and father. His name was cleared. Silas stood before it, his vision blurring. Joshua had lived, had made it out of the canyon, through the tunnel, to this place, had survived another 11 years after fleeing his hidden sanctuary, and someone had known to add those words. His name was cleared. Someone had known about Hadley's confession, about Joshua's vindication. The second marker stood beside the first. Sarah Elizabeth Mercer, 1864-1918, beloved wife and mother. She never lost faith. Sarah had outlived her husband by 15 years, had lived to see the new century, had weathered whatever life threw at her after their escape. Silas felt a surge of gratitude that she'd had those extra years, even if they'd been without Joshua. The third and fourth markers were smaller, set side by side. Margaret Rose Mercer Thompson, 1881-1954, and Annabel May Mercer Davis, 1883-1949. Silas read those names twice, his mind working through the implications. The girls had lived, had grown up, gotten married, taken their husbands' names, had lived long lives, Margaret to age 73, Annabel to 66. Annabel, the name Margaret had given her doll. Sarah had written about it in her letters. And here was a second daughter by that name, perhaps born later after they'd settled here. Or had Silas misread the family photograph? Perhaps there had been 4 children, not 3. But Thomas, where was Thomas's marker? Silas searched the area around the family plot, but found no stone for the boy, which could mean many things. Thomas might have died elsewhere, been buried in another town, or he might still be alive, would be in his 60s now if he'd survived. The mystery wasn't completely solved after all. But the main questions had been answered. The Mercers had escaped, had made it through the tunnel to this ghost town, though it probably hadn't been a ghost town then, had probably still been a living community. They'd built new lives here under their own names, no longer hiding, had lived and loved and eventually died, as everyone must, and someone had cared enough to mark their graves properly, to commemorate them, to ensure they were remembered. Movement caught his eye, not wind, but something deliberate. There on top of Joshua's marker, something metallic gleamed in the afternoon sun. Silas stepped closer and saw it clearly, a pocket watch, gold or brass that had been kept polished. It sat prominently on the flat top of the gravestone, deliberately placed, not dropped or forgotten. Silas picked it up with careful hands. The case was warm from the sun, heavy, well made. He pressed the catch and it opened smoothly, revealing a watch face with Roman numerals and hands frozen at 3:47. When the watch had stopped, whenever that had been, no one had bothered to wind it again. But inside the case, engraved in flowing script, were words that made Silas's throat close. To Joshua, my love eternal, SM, Sarah's gift to her husband, probably given on some anniversary or special occasion back before their world fell apart. And now it sat on his grave, a memorial, a marker of love that had endured through exile and hardship and loss. Silas turned the watch over in his hands and found more engraving on the back of the case. Fresher, added later, left here by his son. Thomas David Mercer, 1942. So others would know the story, Thomas. The boy had survived, had lived to middle age, long enough to return to this ghost town and place his father's watch on the grave as both memorial and message. Had wanted people to know the story, to understand what his family had endured, and Silas had found it. 53 years after the Mercers fled the canyon, 58 years after they first arrived there, 60-some years after Joshua was falsely accused, Silas Rourke, a grieving widower who'd stumbled into their hidden sanctuary by accident, had pieced together their story. He sat down on the stone wall, the watch in one hand and Sarah's locket in the other, and felt something break open in his chest. Not pain exactly, more like the release of pressure that had been building for 3 years, or maybe longer. The Mercers had lost everything, their home, their community, their reputation. They'd been forced to hide, to run, to start over with nothing but each other. And they'd done it. They'd survived. They'd raised their children, maintained their love, lived full lives despite everything that had been taken from them. And here was Silas, who'd had everything, a wife who loved him, a community that supported him, a home and land and life worth living, and he'd chosen to throw it away. Had chosen to hide, not from false accusations or corrupt lawmen, but from his own grief, from the hard work of continuing to live after loss. The Mercers hadn't had a choice. He did. Clara had known this, had tried to make him promise not to shut down. But he hadn't understood then what she was asking, hadn't grasped that choosing to keep living was the hardest thing he'd ever have to do. But now, sitting in this abandoned cemetery with the physical evidence of one family's courage in his hands, he understood. The Mercers were offering him a lesson across the decades, not in how to hide, but in how to survive. Not in how to withdraw, but in how to endure and build, and keep loving even when everything seems lost. Joshua had died here, in this little mining town, had been buried by people who knew his story and honored his memory. Sarah had lived on without him, had raised her children, had kept faith. The children had grown up and made families of their own, had lived into old age, carrying their parents' story. They'd chosen life, even when life had been unfair and brutal. They'd chosen connection, even when isolation would have been easier. They'd chosen to keep moving forward. Silas looked at the watch, at the inscription from Sarah, "My love eternal." That's what she'd promised Joshua, and she'd kept that promise even after he was gone. Had lived another 15 years without him, but had never stopped loving him, just as Silas would never stop loving Clara. But loving her memory didn't mean dying alongside her. It meant honoring her by keeping the promise he'd made, by returning to life, to community, to the hard and beautiful work of being fully human. The sun was low on the horizon now, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Silas needed to start back if he wanted to reach the canyon before full dark. But he sat a moment longer, saying a silent prayer for the Mercers, thanking them for the gift they'd given him without knowing it. Then he stood, placed the watch back on Joshua's marker, where Thomas had left it, and began the long climb back up to the tunnel, back through the mountain, back to Duchess and the hidden canyon, back, eventually to his own life and the choice to live it fully. The journey back through the tunnel was easier somehow, even though Silas was tired and the light was fading. He knew the path now, knew where the tight spots were, where to duck his head, and where to use his hands for support. More than that, he was traveling with purpose, rather than desperate curiosity. He'd found what he was looking for, and now he could return and do what needed to be done. It was full dark by the time he emerged from the cave on the ridge, but the moon was bright enough to guide his descent. Duchess nickered when she heard him approach the cave, relief evident in her greeting. He spent a few minutes with her, checking her leg one more time, nearly healed now, strong enough for the journey home, and assuring her with quiet words that he was back, that everything was all right. He slept that night in the cabin for the last time, and his sleep was deep and dreamless, in a way it hadn't been since before Clara died. Morning came with purpose. Silas spent the day documenting everything methodically. He had an old camera in his saddlebag, nothing fancy. Just a small film camera he'd carried for years to photograph fence breaks and cattle, and he used it now to capture the canyon, the homestead, the artifacts. He took notes in a small journal, recording dates from the Mercers' journals, descriptions of what he'd found, the location of their graves in the ghost town beyond the mountain. This story needed to be preserved properly, needed to be shared with people who could appreciate its significance. The Historical Society, certainly. The county records office, maybe even a newspaper, though Silas had never been one for publicity. But more than that, Joshua's name needed to be officially cleared. Hadley's confession, hidden for 53 years, needed to reach the authorities and become part of the public record. Joshua Mercer deserved vindication, and his descendants, Thomas, if he still lived, or Margaret's and Annabel's children and grandchildren, deserved to know their family history without the taint of false accusations. In the afternoon, Silas found a piece of juniper wood, solid and straight-grained, and set to work with his knife. He'd learned basic woodworking from his father and grandfather, and while he was no master craftsman, he could manage a simple cross. He carved carefully, letting the wood guide him, shaping it into something that would stand against weather and time. When the cross was finished, he used the tip of his knife to inscribe words into the crossbeam. The Mercer family found peace in this sacred place. 1889. He planted it in front of the homestead, tamping the earth firm around its base. It wasn't much, just a simple marker, but it felt right. The canyon had been the Mercers' refuge, their sanctuary, and even though they'd been forced to leave, it deserved to be remembered as the place where they'd been safe, where they'd been together, where they'd built something beautiful despite their fear. Silas gathered the artifacts with care. The journals, both Joshua's and Sarah's letters, the family photograph in its wooden frame, the tin daguerreotype, the locket he'd found in the tunnel, the doll from the children's bed, which he wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, Hadley's confession and badge, the most important pieces of all. These would come with him, would be delivered to the right people, would tell the Mercer's story to anyone willing to listen. He took one last walk through the canyon, as the afternoon sun painted everything gold. The waterfalls still sang their eternal song. The pool reflected the sky like a mirror. The grass grew green and lush, impossible in this desert country, preserved by the canyon's unique microclimate and protected isolation. It was beautiful. It would remain beautiful long after Silas was gone, after everyone who'd known the Mercers was gone, after even the memory of them faded. But at least now someone knew. At least now their story wouldn't be completely lost. "Thank you," Silas said aloud to the empty homestead, to the ghost of Joshua and Sarah and their children. "Thank you for showing me what I needed to see." He saddled Duchess in the fading light, loaded his gear, secured the artifacts carefully in his saddlebag alongside the journals. The mare was restless, ready to move, her injured leg fully healed now. She'd saved his life by leading him here. Now she would carry him home. They left as the stars began to emerge, retracing the path they'd taken during the storm. But everything looked different now. The narrow arroyo was just a drainage, not a desperate shelter. The broken fence line was a task to be completed, not evidence of his failing. The empty hills were familiar country, not a prison. 3 days later, Silas rode into Cottonwood Springs with his saddlebag full of history. He went first to the county records office, then to the Historical Society, then, when they suggested it, to the newspaper. The story spread quickly. People were fascinated by the hidden canyon, by the family who'd lived there in secret, by the false accusations and eventual vindication that had come too late for Joshua to know about. Martha at the diner insisted on hearing the whole story over coffee. Tom Bigay stopped by the ranch to ask questions, then invited Silas to that poker game he'd mentioned weeks ago. Sarah Chen called to say her daughter would love to interview him about the discovery for a school project. Silas found himself saying yes, found himself accepting invitations, engaging in conversations, reconnecting with the community he'd withdrawn from. It wasn't easy. Grief still ambushed him at unexpected moments, and there were days when he wanted nothing more than to hide in his house and avoid the world, but he kept the promise he'd made to Clara, kept the lesson he'd learned from the Mercers. He chose to live, even when living was hard, chose connection, even when isolation felt safer. 6 weeks after returning from the canyon, official word came that Joshua Mercer's name had been formally cleared from all territorial records. The Historical Society was planning an exhibit about the family. A genealogist had tracked down 3 living grandchildren of Margaret and Annabel, elderly themselves now, who were grateful beyond words to learn their grandfather's true story. Silas attended the opening of the exhibit, stood beside enlarged photographs of the journals and artifacts, answered questions from visitors who wanted to know more. And when it was over, when he drove back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years: peace. He sat on his porch that evening with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of copper and gold. Duchess grazed peacefully in the corral, healthy and strong. Inside the house, Clara's photograph sat on the mantel where it had always been. Silas took out his compass, her compass, and opened it. The needle swung and settled, pointing steadily north. "So you'll always find your way back to me," she'd said. "I got lost for a while," he said quietly, talking to her the way he used to, the way he'd stopped doing after she died. "But I found my way. An injured horse and a hidden canyon, and a family I never met. They showed me how to find my way back. Back to living. Back to the world. Back to keeping the promise I made to you." The sun touched the horizon, spreading gold across the desert. Duchess raised her head and looked toward the house, and Silas felt not alone, not empty, just a man who'd loved deeply and lost terribly and somehow found his way through to the other side. He'd carry Clara with him always, just as he'd carry the Mercers' story. But carrying their memory didn't mean stopping. It meant moving forward, honoring them by living fully, by staying connected, by choosing every day to be part of the world rather than apart from it. Sometimes, Silas thought as the stars began to emerge overhead, you have to get lost in the wilderness to find your way home. Sometimes you have to follow an injured horse down an impossible path to discover what you've been searching for all along. Not answers exactly, not solutions or cures for grief, but something simpler and more profound. The courage to keep living, the strength to stay connected, the wisdom to know that loving someone doesn't end when they die, it just changes form, becomes something you carry forward into whatever days remain. The canyon was out there still, hidden and sacred, keeping its secrets. The Mercers were out there too, sleeping in their graves in a ghost town that would itself soon return to dust. But their story lived on. Their courage, their love, their refusal to surrender to despair, all of it lived on in Silas's telling, in the historical record, in the hearts of those who heard and understood. And Silas Rourke, 58 years old and finally ready to rejoin the world, sat on his porch with Clara's compass in his hand and made a promise to himself. To her, to the Mercers, to everyone who'd ever lost someone they loved and had to find a way to keep going, he would live, fully, completely, with all the joy and pain that entailed. Because that's what they would have wanted. That's what love required, not forgetting. Never forgetting, but living anyway, despite everything, because of everything, with a grateful heart and open hands, and the courage to face whatever came next. The stars wheeled overhead. The desert breathed around him. And for the first time in 3 years, Silas Rourke felt truly at home.